If you've ever finished Breaking Bad and felt genuinely unsettled, not entertained, not satisfied, but actually unsettled, there's a reason for that. And it's not the violence, it's not the drug empire, it's not even the body count, it's something far more disturbing than any of that. Walter White is the only villain in television history who started exactly where you are right now, sitting in a house he couldn't quite afford, worried about money, feeling like the world had taken something from him that he deserved. And the terrifying part, the part that stays with you long after the credits roll, is how reasonable every single step of his descent felt in the moment he took it. This is why Walter White is the most terrifying villain television has ever produced. And by the time we're done, you'll understand exactly why no character before or since has managed to do what Vince Gilligan pulled off with this show. The terror starts before he does a single bad thing. The show opens with a man who has every reason to feel wronged by the world. Walter White has a PhD in chemistry. He was a co-founder of a company, Gray Matter Technologies, that went on to be worth billions of dollars. He left early, sold his share for $5,000, and spent the next 20 years watching his former partners become obscenely wealthy while he taught high school chemistry to teenagers who didn't care and moonlighted at a car wash to cover his bills. His son has cerebral palsy, his wife is pregnant, and then he gets a terminal cancer diagnosis with maybe 2 years left to live. That is not a villain's origin story. That is a tragedy, and Vince Gilligan knew exactly what he was doing by building that much genuine sympathy before Walt did anything wrong. Because the horror of Breaking Bad isn't watching a bad man do bad things. It's watching a good man, or at least a man you understand, make choices that are completely logical given everything he's been handed. Every single person watching that pilot felt some version of the same thing. I get it. I understand why he's doing this. That feeling right there is the trap, and you are already inside it before the first episode ends. The first reason Walt is terrifying is that his intelligence makes everything worse. Most fictional villains are terrifying because they're powerful. They have armies, resources, physical dominance. Walt has none of that. What Walt has is a brain that processes the world at a level nobody around him can match, and the discipline to use it without hesitation in situations where most people would freeze completely. Think about the phosphine gas scene in the RV. Walt is being held at gunpoint by 2 men who have already decided to kill him. He has seconds. No weapon, no backup, no exit. And in the time it takes most people to panic, Walt has scanned the chemicals around him, identified a reaction that produces toxic gas, figured out the container he needs, and executed the plan while appearing to cooperate. By the time Emilio and Crazy 8 understood what was happening, it was already over. That is not cinematic exaggeration. That is a man whose brain genuinely works that way, cataloging, calculating, solving, in conditions of extreme stress. And what makes it terrifying is not the outcome. It's the realization that Walt's intelligence is not a superpower he turns on for special occasions. It is always running, in every room, in every conversation, against every person he encounters. He is always 3 moves ahead of everyone around him, and most of the time the people around him don't even know they're playing. The second reason Walt is terrifying is that he weaponizes the trust of people who love him. Here is one of the most evil things Walter White does across the entire run of the show, and it barely gets discussed because it's so quiet. At the end of season 4, Walt needs Jesse back on his side to execute the plan against Gus Fring. Jesse is grieving because a child he cares about, Brock, his girlfriend's young son, has been poisoned and hospitalized. Jesse is devastated and suspicious and starting to ask dangerous questions about how it happened. Walt had poisoned Brock himself, not with ricin. He calculated the exact non-lethal dosage of a lily-of-the-valley plant to make the boy severely ill without killing him. He knew precisely how much of that compound would produce serious symptoms in a child of that size without crossing the line into fatal. He did the chemistry, he administered it, and then he stood next to Jesse in that hospital, watched him cry over a child's hospital bed, put his hand on his shoulder, and redirected that grief into rage aimed directly at Gus Fring. The violence in Breaking Bad is disturbing, but this scene is something else entirely, because Walt didn't just use his chemistry to poison a child. He used Jesse's love for that child as a manipulation tool. He identified the emotional vulnerability, calculated the intervention required to exploit it, and executed it with the same precision he brought to every cook. There is no moment in the entire series that better illustrates what Walter White actually is, underneath the rationalization and the justifications. This is a man who will do anything, to anyone, and feel completely justified in doing it. The third reason Walt is terrifying is the way his transformation is completely invisible until it's complete. This is the genius of what Vince Gilligan built over 5 seasons. Walt's transformation from desperate chemistry teacher to full criminal architect doesn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It happens in increments so small that the audience keeps adjusting their threshold without noticing. Each individual step seems reasonable given the step before it. And by the time Walt does something genuinely monstrous, letting Jane choke to death in front of him, poisoning Brock, ordering the deaths of Mike's 9 men in prison simultaneously, the audience has already followed him so far down the path that they're still half defending him. Watch Season 1 Walt and Season 5 Walt back to back, and you are looking at two completely different human beings. Season 1 Walt is trembling in the desert in his underwear, terrified and desperate, cooking meth to leave his family some money before he dies. Season 5 Walt is sitting across from Gus Fring's successor, telling him that the only reason he's still alive is that Walt hasn't decided to kill him yet, and meaning every word of it. The distance between those two men is enormous. But at no individual point in the journey did Walt take a step large enough to make the audience fully stop and reckon with what was happening. That is not an accident of storytelling. That is a deliberate, precise, sustained piece of writing that mirrors exactly how real people actually change, not in dramatic revelations, but in small surrenders, one at a time, until the person they used to be is simply gone. The fourth reason Walt is terrifying is that he always has a justification, and the justifications always sound reasonable. Walt never does anything without a reason, and the reasons are always constructed with enough internal logic that they're hard to dismiss outright. He's cooking meth to provide for his family, he's defending himself from people who would kill him, he's protecting Jesse, he's responding to a situation that was forced on him by someone else's actions. Every single act of violence, manipulation, and moral collapse in the entire series has a Walt-approved explanation attached to it that contains just enough truth to be defensible. This is what separates Walt from every conventional television villain. A conventional villain does terrible things because they are terrible. Their motivations are simple: greed, power, sadism. Walt does terrible things and then explains to you, with complete sincerity, in complete detail, why he had no other choice. And the explanations are good. They're not delusional ravings. They are coherent, logical arguments that identify real grievances and real constraints and real threats. The problem is not that Walt's reasoning is crazy. The problem is that Walt's reasoning is exactly what anyone uses when they want to do something they already know is wrong and need to feel okay about it. The moment the mask fully drops is in the final season in a single sentence to Skylar. She asks if he did all of it, for the family. And Walt, for the first and only time, tells the truth. He says, "I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive. 5 seasons of justifications, 5 seasons of family first, and I had no choice, and you forced me into this," and it all collapses into one sentence. He didn't do it for his family. He did it because for the first time in 20 years he felt like himself. Everything else was a story he told to avoid knowing that. The fifth reason Walt is terrifying is what he reveals about the people watching him. This is the part that Vince Gilligan talked about openly. The fact that audience response to Walter White surprised even the people who made the show. Viewers rooted for Walt, deeply, passionately, sometimes furiously. When Skylar pushed back against what he was doing, audiences turned on her with a hostility so intense that Anna Gunn, the actress who played her, wrote an op-ed about receiving genuine threats. People called Skylar a nag. They called her an obstacle. They wanted her to get out of the way so Walt could do what he needed to do. What those viewers were actually saying, without realizing it, was that they had followed Walt so completely that they had adopted his frame. Skylar wasn't a woman trying to protect her children from a drug kingpin husband. She was an obstacle to the story they wanted to see. They wanted Walt to win. And the show let them want that. Let them cheer for him. Let them enjoy the victories right alongside him. And then, at the very end, showed them exactly who they had been cheering for. That is what makes Walter White the most terrifying villain in television history. Not the body count, not the empire, not the chemistry. It's the mirror. Every other villain on television allows the audience to sit comfortably on the outside and watch evil happen to other people. Walter White sits you down inside the perspective of a man becoming a monster, makes you understand every step he takes, and then at the very end forces you to reckon with the fact that you understood it, that you followed it, that some part of you even admired it. The terror of Walter White is not that a man like him exists. It's that the path he took makes sense. The resentment that started it makes sense. The first compromise makes sense. And the next one. And the next one. The terror is not the destination. It's the realization that the road there is paved with logic you recognize, with feelings you've had, with justifications you've used. Vince Gilligan said from the beginning that the show was about turning Mr. Chips into Scarface. What he actually built was something far more unsettling than that. He built a 5-season argument that the distance between a good person and Walter White is not a chasm. It's a series of small steps, each one reasonable, each one justified, each one just slightly further than the last, until the person who started the walk is so far behind you that you can't even see them anymore. And the screen goes dark, and you sit there, and you realize the most frightening thing about Walter White was never anything he did. It was how long you rooted for him before you stopped. The sixth reason Walt is terrifying is that he never loses control of the narrative, even when everything else is falling apart. One of the most underrated aspects of Walter White as a villain is his ability to control how situations are framed, not just what happens, but what people believe about what happened. He is not just a chemist, and not just a strategist. He is a storyteller, and he uses that skill with the same cold precision he applies to everything else. When Hank finally confronts him in the garage with a GPS tracker and the certainty that Walt is Heisenberg, Walt doesn't panic. He sits with it for a moment, absorbs the situation, and then calmly begins dismantling Hank's position piece by piece. He tells Hank he has no proof that would survive a courtroom. He tells him that even if he somehow built a case, Walt would be dead from cancer before it ever reached trial. He looks a seasoned DEA agent in the eye and tells him to tread lightly, and means it. And then, days later, Walt hands Hank a DVD, a confession tape. On it, Walt weeps and describes in precise, convincing detail how Hank Schrader was the true mastermind, how he forced a dying chemistry teacher to cook meth under threat of violence, how the $177,000 of drug money that paid for Hank's medical rehabilitation was a payment, not a gift. Every detail is calibrated. Every piece of evidence Walt references is real, just recontextualized. Hank watches himself become a suspect in his own investigation, and there is nothing he can do about it because Walt has made the truth indistinguishable from the lie. Most criminals, when cornered, try to run or fight. Walt rewrites the story. He doesn't just play chess, he edits the board while his opponent is still staring at it. The fake confession tape is perhaps the single most clinical demonstration of Walt's intelligence across the entire series, because it requires not just knowledge of the facts, but a complete model of how those facts will be perceived, processed, and acted upon by everyone who encounters them. Walt doesn't just know chemistry, he knows people. He knows how they think, what they fear, what they want to believe, and he uses that knowledge as fluently as he uses a periodic table. And the final reason, the one that ties everything together, is that Walt wins. Not completely, not without devastating cost, but in the terms that matter most to Walter White, he wins. His son will receive his money. His empire cannot be taken from him because he's already dying. He saves Jesse. He eliminates every enemy who threatened his family. He looks Gretchen and Elliot Schwartz, the people he blamed for stealing the life he deserved, in the eye one last time and bends them completely to his will, using nothing but laser pointers and reputation. And he dies on his own terms, in his lab, surrounded by the equipment that made him feel more alive than anything else ever had. Television history is full of villains who are ultimately defeated, imprisoned, or destroyed in ways that restore the moral order of the world. The system works. Good wins. Evil is punished. Walter White does not give the audience that comfort. He burns everything down around him. His marriage, his family, his brother-in-law, his former partner, his own soul, and then walks through the wreckage with something terrifyingly close to peace. The final shot of the series is Walt dying slowly on a meth lab floor, hand resting on a piece of equipment, the ghost of a smile on his face. He is not being punished. He is not suffering. He found the thing that made him feel real. He pursued it to the absolute end, and he died having been completely, honestly himself, maybe for the first time in his life. That is the ending Vince Gilligan chose. Not justice, not defeat. A man who destroyed everything and everyone around him, dying exactly as he wanted to, in the place he loved most, having finally told the truth about who he was. The most terrifying villains are not the ones who are stopped. They are the ones who finish what they started. Walter White finished what he started, and the world he left behind is worse for every person who loved him. That is why no villain in the history of television has ever come close to what Breaking Bad built across 5 seasons. Not because Walt was the most violent, or the most powerful, or the most ruthless, but because he was the most human. Because the thing that made him a monster was not a mutation, or a trauma, or a character defect unique to him. It was ambition. It was pride. It was the very normal, very human feeling that the world owed him more than it gave him, and the decision, made once and then 1,000 more times after that, to take it anyway. Walter White is the most terrifying villain in television history because he is not a warning about what monsters do to people. He is a warning about what people do to themselves. One perfectly logical, completely justifiable step at a time. If you want to see every specific moment Walt's genius showed up in the show, every time he outthought everyone in the room using nothing but chemistry and cold calculation, that video is right here.